Okay, so we're going to get into a little bit about disaster readiness. Again, what we just started with was an introduction to what those disaster profiles are specific to earthquakes and wildfires. We know that there's a lot of other vulnerabilities, but those are the two we're focused on today. We also kind of went through what our original case study was for today with Ed on his experience specifically with the wildfire, so we're having that conversation. Before we jump further into readiness, are there any other questions about what we've discussed thus far, how anyone approached anything? I think we had a question still. Yes.
I just have one quick question about communication, right?
So a question about communication. I'm just making sure the Zoom team members hear us. So panelists, if you can just repeat the question before you answer it.
So basically, when the wildfires happened, how did that affect the communication area itself? Did you have to go outside the area to communicate with people, with other agencies?
Up in Paradise, the electrical and phone systems were down, but we pretty much had self-service retained. And so there was communication throughout the land, literal communication. We didn't have to send out smoke signals. We didn't have to spend carrier pigeons or special couriers. We were able to communicate with our network.
Not that way in Spokane necessarily. So specifically in the Elk community, or when they had the Oregon Road fire up there, so very rural area, and it did burn up all of their cell service and their broadband up there, and there was significant impacts in the Medical Lake area as well. So emergency resources were brought in to support the cellular service. So that was a communication issue. Didn't affect the radios for our firefighting crews, but it did affect for individuals. We were able to get the message out early enough to most people, so everybody got the message, was able to evacuate. We were lucky, didn't have a lot of fatalities.
And Joel, and I'm going to throw these in just because if you're not, I may not have communicated, and I worked for state emergency management for a long time on the East Coast, so I just wanted to help understand how some of these organizations work together. So at the county level or city level, did they have any requests for satellite phones or anything else to be able to bring in to that area?
Yes, we specifically, so as you know, the resource request, if you have a need, you go to your county, city, and they get it up to us. So we supported several different IT requests for locals and brought in COW, as they call it, or is a cellular on wheels. So kind of like those those camera trucks you see at like the Lowe's and Home Depot parking lots or around. Looks very similar, about the same size, but comes up and it's got cell repeaters on top, and they'll broadband that in. So we did bring in some in our northern area, 'cause we had two fires on either side of Spokane, both areas to provide that support. But there's a lag there. We also had a major DSHS facility that was impacted, so healthcare facility in the area. And so that we had to bring in additional resources so they could have access to patient charts and things of that nature. So those are all resources. Again, if you see those needs, get with your locals and they elevate to us, and we work with federal partners to bring in some of these assets brought in. We're federal partners. Some of our contracts at the state level that we hold that we can activate based on request, and we're able to fund those initial assistance.
So it's just so everyone's aware at the local level, it truly is in the emergency management realm. Again, the importance of knowing who your stakeholders are is they are consistently working with their state counterparts. This is very normal. There are a lot of state resources, and if the state cannot get the resources, they will communicate with other states to bring in the resources. So whether it's local to Oregon, or if it's because of the fact that in this area, the Pacific Northwest, it was all impacted, they might pull in from South Carolina or Florida to be able to bring in additional resources, whether it's personnel, whether it's, I've seen resource requests between South Carolina and Louisiana for boats, for trucks, for people, for specialties, for additional logistics folks when it comes to some of the water needs. So I know this is something that you don't need to worry about in your day-to-day, but if you were to have an event and there were to be a need, there is a way for you to potentially tap some of your public partnerships to be able to have additional resources brought in.
Just by show of hands, how many of you all know who you should contact locally if there's a disaster that happens? All right. About a quarter of the room. So yeah, this is one thing that will identify at least which office you would start with, and you'll get this down in your plan. Vitally important to do. Like Joe said, like Brittany keeps saying, it starts locally. They communicate with the folks at the state, and the state communicates with folks at the federal level. hate to sound bureaucratic, but that's how it's set up all around. It's important also to know who those state and federal partners are, but things need to follow that flow to make sure everything is coordinated. And just jumping ahead, during the break, we talked about recovery begins on the first day of response, right? So starting to identify what some of your needs are immediately and getting those to the parties, both at the state and local, at the state level and then ultimately to the federal level, may actually impact the type of long-term recovery resources that are made available to you all.
Thank you, Fred. Any other questions at this time? Yes. So what I'm hearing is, just for those online, that we really are hearing, we're used to Eastern Washington, a lot of wildfires being the main trend, but for Western Washington, how serious is it right now? What does this look like and what should they be preparing for?
It's a concern because as I was talking to people in the break, if you haven't heard the term of WUI or wildland urban interface. So that is the space where trees and forest and fields interact with where people live. And that is most of the west side of the state, falls in a lot of that categories. And you should have maps in your local areas. We track it at the state. Just where those, and that's the most dangerous populations, when those trees are up around the homes and when foliage is right up close to the house. So we talk about, with rebuilding, talk about step off and fire-resistant landscaping and design. Like, do you have stand-up? Do you have shrubs right in front of your windows, in front of your house that could catch fire and catch your home on fire? So those are the kind of things. And because we haven't had the wildfire concern as we've developed this side of the state, there's a lot of gap. We have a lot of danger in that WUI space, is how we work on that. And then the fuels that I talked about earlier, a lot of this hasn't burned before, or hasn't burned in so many years that there's a lot of debris. If you just walk through your local parks on the west side, if you look off to the side, there's usually a lot of debris, and that's all fuels that dries out, catches fire, and burns. So it is a threat, and we get a bad fire with the wrong, I'm going to say the wrong wind conditions. It'll push through and wipe out whole towns on the west side of the state. So there's concern, and we all know climate change is a thing. And as it gets drier, as it gets warmer, we're going to see this more prevalently. And it's going to be a couple bad ones, kind of similar to what we saw in California and some of these communities before I think we really get some drastic change. So that's kind of what we're talking about, the threat. So the threat is increasing on the west side. It's still lower than the east side because there's generally higher winds. Things move a little quicker over there. It gets a little warmer and drier. But we've had some major fires on this side. We get fires all through the Cascades every summer, and if the winds shift, we could be losing whole towns. So I'm going to go back a few more years. I'm not sure if people in the state understand the fires in Malden. So smaller community, but similar impact. We lost the whole town. Pretty much every structure of the town was gone. So they're just now rebuilding. But it's a smaller thing, but it just wiped out the whole town. Everybody pretty much got out. Most everybody got out, but everything's gone. So.
It's interesting, in the 90s, I remember it was Smokey the Bear, only you can prevent forest fires, right? We've all heard that. But now it's like, only you can mitigate wildfires. Yes.
I was just going to add to this conversation. I don't know how many of my colleagues here have sustainability or resource conservation department in your PHA, but that's one of the things that we're definitely planning to do, because I think landscaping and trees and shrubs and water and all those things that we think about really carefully in our properties are going to be marshaled or in peril when it happens. And so I think it's really important to get all the good minds together.
And which housing authority are you with? Kent County? And you have, it's called Sustainability and Resource Conservation, and that is part of your housing authority. It's like a department, or is it one person?
Yep.
Okay, it's a department, of 3 team members that are able to kind of really plan out when it comes to the landscaping and how things are done from a sustainable way, but it sounds like also it's that mitigation when it comes to any type of event, whether it's flooding, whether it's a fire, to ensure that things are carefully planned and thought out.
Yeah, and they're doing they're doing much more than that.
Of course.
They're thinking about things like APY, they're thinking about heat zones,
And probably solar or any other energy conservation.
all of our fleet is transitioning to be electric vehicles, so all of those things.
That's really helpful, especially with a lot of the federal funding that's been coming out, whether it's IIJA, the Infrastructure and Jobs Investment Act. I probably messed that up. But there's other federal funding opportunities right now that PHAs can capitalize on to fund some of these initiatives. So that makes a lot of sense. Fred, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, one of the things that I learned working the Paradise Fire is that there's actually fire retardant landscaping, right? So there are shrubs that you can plant that will protect your buildings in a fire, and there are all types of mitigation things you can do on the outside of buildings, including, just having soakers, like a super soaker. It's a little bit more elaborate than that, but there's some things that you could potentially set up that and could be funded by the federal government through an office like Joe's under the FEMA's mitigation funding. There are opportunities. We'll get jumping a little bit ahead of things.
And we
to come.
will tomorrow have a FEMA representative that's going to really go through some of those programs and resources. So we'll touch on FEMA today. I think especially probably both Butte County and Joel and myself have a lot of experience specifically with FEMA, but we will have FEMA here to also answer these questions tomorrow. Ed?
Just a comment in answer to the question about risk. America's West, if you look at our history over thousands of years, the history of America's West really is dominated by the history of fire. Look at the Big Burn in 1910. It burned off an area the size of the state of Connecticut. So this is a recurring feature of the world we work in. And any community I drive into where I see 100-foot tall pine trees everywhere, I reel in horror, because in Paradise it was magnificent. Before 2018, hillside covered in these giant pines, thick forests. I remember the first time I saw it 20 years ago, driving up there, I said, oh my goodness, this place is waiting for a fire. So any place that has tall pines, and lots of them, in a dry climate is subject to wildfire. So the risk is very present, and I think we'd be kidding ourselves to say otherwise. But I did want to come back to preparedness, because there were a few things that we did that, in hindsight, really did help us
Yeah.
prepare for the fire.
Well,
if I
that's
may.
perfect. So we'll go ahead and get to the next slide because this goes right into our case study of questions as well. So questions that, Ed, I'd really be interested in is, did you have plans? Had you done exercises? And who did you have relationships with before? And who did you wish you had the relationships with?
Okay, other than our agency plan, Section 8 plan, ACOP, et cetera, we didn't have any plans anticipating a disaster. However, we've been through a number of disaster-related exercises in the previous decade. I mentioned the Oroville Dam disaster. We consider sequestration back in the early 2010s to be kind of a disaster. We had to plan for worst and base case scenarios, covering an enormous range of action that we've seen, earthquakes, et cetera. But what really lent us the resilience I speak of? First of all, leadership is important, but looking for those transferable skill sets. We as housing authorities do a lot of work in collaboration, both internally and externally. We run into grant opportunities. Oh, you've got 3 days to apply for this grant. That's a disaster. You gather staff up, you create a plan, you take a plan of action, and you go forward. We do this all the time. This is sort of what we do. That's all of what we do really lends itself to disaster recovery, because we operate in a culture that really is a caretaking culture. We're designed to be a responsive culture, which is what you need in a disaster. But a couple parts of that are really important. One, the continuum of care network. We've worked the continuum of care as long as continuum of cares have been around. As a housing authority, we think it's really important, not so much for what we get done in the continuum of care. We take umbrage of all the expectations laid on us for free that we have to respond to in the continuum. But what it does do is, through the continuum of care, we know all the other players in the community. We know all the other service agencies. We know all the jurisdictions. We know their housing officers. We know their plans. We all know each other. We're collegial. We work together. This is our community, and it's a broader community, Butte County. And that community, the continuum of care community, folds into a larger community, the state community. We have lots of allies and associates. You know, we as housing authorities, we build networks. We build networks, but not just with the COC, but we build networks with all of our work associates. If you don't have a really good network of contacts at HUD, you're not doing your job. If you don't have a really good network with all the people running your state programs, you're not doing your job. Those networks are actually what you rely on in an emergency, and we did very much. I also want to say, in the context of disaster, and we'll be moving in this direction, but how do you respond to a disaster? There's really 3 layers. After the disaster hits, there's this first phase of triage. What do you do with people? And the second phase is sort of what we call transitional housing. Where do you park them until you can find permanent housing? And the third phase is permanent housing. Based on our observation and takeaway, in this country, we do really well on the triage. We're all emergency caretakers. We love putting people in the back of an ambulance, taking them to the hospital. What happens after them, we don't really care so much about. But we love that triage phase. When this disaster hit, there were more service agencies, more global. We had nonprofits from Korea showing up, handing out money to people, cash. It was extraordinary. But when it came to actually finding housing and housing opportunity, that was the real disaster. That we have no resiliency or rubber band in our nation. And I'll speak locally, but I think I can extend that nationally. This is a problem collectively we really need to get after in order to really adequately be able to respond to disasters in the first place. So again, you know, our strength, how we set ourselves up is you try to build a resilient culture, and you're as connected to the community as you possibly can. Because it's in those connections that really enables a coherent disaster response. When our disaster happened, we had the Governor's Office of Emergency Services, California Governor's Office, swoop into town. We thought they were swooping into town on the promise of help and money, and resources. No, they were really just there to facilitate a lot of meetings. One of the things that will happen in the immediate wake of a disaster is you will get meetinged out. Everybody on the sun wants to meet to talk about this, that, the other thing, because there's all this frenetic activity. What do we do? How do we do it? Who's going to do it? Et cetera. So this idea, right, your ability to meet and communicate and network is really at the heart of your strength.
That's interesting, Ed. So when it comes to even talking about how it went for Butte, but for our colleagues, everyone to be thinking about is, did you put certain people in charge of certain subjects or topics? Because you could not be at every meeting.
You have to pick and choose, yes. But there was a lot of delegation that goes on. One of the things we did as a first response, we hired a housing navigator. Recognizing that there was no place to put people, we said, well, maybe we can find places for them. So we had this navigator calling apartment complexes throughout, everywhere west of the Mississippi. HUD gave us lists of all their multifamily housing. I mean, we really worked it. And what we discovered was there's no housing opportunity anywhere west of the Mississippi. There was no place to put people. Even when we found places, the occasional vacancy in the occasional apartment complex, our people from Butte County, they're local, they're rural, they're poor, they don't know anything else. The last place they want to move is Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, Montana, the Dakotas. They don't,
Right.
To them, that's like moving to the moon. So when you're dealing with locals, particularly in rural areas, you're really dealing with a population that doesn't want to go anywhere. So the first question you have to ask in the triage, if you have a lot of people displaced, where do you put them? Where do they go? In the Paradise Fire, it was rather interesting. Paradise is up on the hill. We have 2 communities below Paradise down in the valley, Chico and Oroville. Chico's about 90,000 and Oroville's about 25, 30,000 people. We had all that 35,000 displaced, mostly show up in Chico and Oroville. And next to the Walmart in Chico, of course, you know Walmart, you're allowed to park overnight and camp. Most of Walmarts in America. Next to Walmart was this 10-acre vacant parcel. the people of Paradise commandeered it, and they set up a tent camp. It was an amazing thing. The first night of that disaster, there were probably 5,000 people out in that field or more, all in tents, little tiny trailers. They'd come down from the mountain, and it was a beautiful exercise in watching human dwelling, what we do as humans on this planet. What's the thing we do? First thing, we set up a shelter, and then we set up a neighborhood of people who are looking out for each other. And then you set up a little community. And I walked out in that tent camp. It was the middle of the night. And there were little cul-de-sacs. Oh, we've never met each other before, but he's the mayor, and we're all watching out for each other. And we're going to live together after this disaster. And it was sort of like, it was so beautiful to see people without regulation, without laws, walking in and doing what we do naturally. Put a piece of cardboard over your head, make some community, and that's the beginning of life. We are not human beings unless we have community and shelter. So it's really interesting, right after, where did we put these people? Well, this was illegal. 5 days later, after this beautiful tent camp was established, it was all functional, it was really cool. The state fire marshal came in and shut it down, said, done, this is a fire hazard, goodbye.
Yeah.
And so that was, another story. But my emphasis here is we're dealing with human beings, and human beings aren't human without a home and a place to stay.
So Ed, who became your second? Like who and how did that happen when it came within your PHA? Was it the person you thought it was going to be, or what was that skill set for that person who helped you along the way?
Oh, the navigator?
Within the PHA, whoever what your second was. What did that look like? Because I'm interested to see how you mentored and fostered them, or if it was the natural innate skill sets that they had, so that you had that second. And if you didn't, that might be a lesson learned.
Well, I guess the way we operate our agency, we have a real strong executive team. There's myself and 3 others, and we meet regularly. And one of them handles all the properties, one of them handles finance, and one of them handles all of our rental assistance programs. And they're very capable people, and we just divvy up the work and go for it. It's been rather intense for a lot of different reasons, but you just. Again, I go back, it's not a matter of reinventing yourself when the disaster happens. It's a matter of having yourself invented and functional when the disaster happens.
Okay. And then who was your champion out from an external partner perspective? Was there anyone that you ended up really working with, whether it was at the county, whether it was with the state, whether it was a very influential person, political or otherwise?
Unfortunately, I have to say your self-reliance is key here.
Okay.
There are no champions out there. FEMA is famed for its disaster response, but FEMA has very specific things it can do under very specific circumstances. And in our situation, for example, FEMA brought in, I believe it was 900 trailers. Those 900 trailers, by FEMA regulation, had to leave 2 years later. So they housed up a bunch of people, and then they displaced a bunch of people. It was just no gain to that system. So no, really, quite frankly, it relies on your own resilience. There's no one who's going to come in and rescue you. There's no champion who's going to come in and pick you up and hug you and say, gee, here's what you need to move forward. No. This is when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And I know there's no tougher group than the group sitting in this room right now. You've seen it all.
So Joel, what do you think about some of this when it comes from a state perspective?
Well, I'll verify that the housing shortage is a significant issue nationally. My team was part of a multi-state FEMA initiative looking at pre-disaster housing, so kind of working with our HUD partners about how do we plan for that transitional housing. That's probably the biggest gap. I mean, we know building homes takes a while, and that's its own problem set, but I think really it's transitional because people are great at setting up shelters. Talk about my background. I did contingency operations, so I've set up hospitals and operations in remote locations around the world, mainly for the DoD while in service. So there's all kinds of volunteer organizations and FEMA programs that can set up shelters anywhere quickly, generally. But shelters only go for so long, so it's that really after that week, or at most 2 weeks, so what do you do with them? If it's a flood, hopefully there's time then to clean it up and repair and get people back to their home, but on a fire, there's no place to put them. So then there's really that transitional housing. How do I hey, they have a home to go back to, but it's not ready. So it might be 2 months, 3 months, or they have no home, and how do we get them so they can rebuild? And so that's a big gap there. And I think, yeah, so there's a lot of internal, like building capacity. Everybody's situation is different, but even in, some of that's our relationships as well. Like if you are at your rope, what are your counterparts? Some of you in the room, is anybody in this room maybe your counterpart? That if you've been going at it for 7 straight days and you just need 6 hours of good rest, is there somebody can come in that you trust that can help maybe make decisions that day? You know what I mean? Those are some of the things that we try to push for our local EMs specifically, especially the small counties that have 3 people in EM shop that have a major disaster. Well, about 72 hours later, they're done. So it's like, hey, what resources can be there? So think about that as well. It might not be somebody, it might be a counterpart in another jurisdiction that can come in and give you that little assistance. That would be one of my targets. But yeah, it's really on the individuals to champion the effort. So.
Okay. And Joel, I'm going to ask you this, but also open it to the panel. What are exercises or plans that PHAs can be involved in, or who should they be communicating to understand that at the local or state level?
Well, it first starts with your community's CEMP, or Community Emergency Management Plan. So that's kind of the base plan for all kind of emergency operations in your jurisdiction. So cities, counties are required in the state of Washington by law, and there's certain specifics in there, like your communications plan with limited English proficiency and access and functional needs considerations. So that's all part of it, but it answers all those questions. Specifically with your population, are some of the most vulnerable populations that we serve. So is being kind of at that table and talk to your local EMs, like 25% of the room kind of knew who the local EM was. Hopefully somebody in your office has that relationship if it's not you. But know who that person is, and be at the table when they're looking at plans. So their plan, but also their CMP is probably the first one. The next one is like, what's the hazard mitigation plan? So every jurisdiction, most jurisdictions have a hazard mitigation plan, and you have to have a plan to get after the hazard mitigation funds. They don't do as much. There is some direct housing stuff, but a lot of it's just community stability stuff. So if there's programs to improve water, to improve, do work in the WUI space and get rid of consumable fuels in a community, those are things you need to be part of that plan and be an eligible applicant. Specifically after disaster, if you want to get after projects in your footprint as a public entity, you can do that. You know what I mean? You can apply for some of these grant streams, but you have to have a plan. It has to be kind of nested within the plan. So those are kind of the 2 big plans I would say, that make sure you're part of the CEMP, and that you're involved in or annexed to or covered by the hazard mitigation plan. And that's going to be at the table to have those conversations, of figure out who that person is and get a seat at some of those tables when they start doing these plans. And they're all cyclical, they're 5-year cycles. So you just got to kind of figure out where they're at in the cycle. And they might have just done it. Well, then start talking to them now, building that relationship. As they start to do updates or improve them, you're set for the next cycle.
Thanks, Joel. I have a question for Fred, but before I get there, I want to open it to the room. Are there any questions about what we're talking about thus far, or about any of these plans? Okay. So one of the things, Fred, I want to ask, because of some of your experience, especially with Louisiana, who has seen back-to-back-to-back disasters, and I think it's transferable to what we're seeing in the Pacific Northwest. If we were to have a large disaster, is that sheltering logistics and having those sister agencies. So can you just speak to a little bit about that? Because I think that's so important in readiness when you're identifying and developing relationships now.
Absolutely. As Ed said, the challenge is finding places for people to stay. One of the things we mentioned that there are volunteer organizations that step in and help out in many ways and provide resources. A key relationship, though, is going to be, especially for your elderly residents, knowing who in the community you can go to for resources there. And typically it's, oh my goodness, I'm blanking on the type of organization. It'll come back to me. But one of the things that we encouraged in Louisiana specifically was having sister housing authorities that you could call and contact when you had a disaster, because if there was a hurricane, it's likely that if there's an evacuation required, that your staff are going to have to evacuate as well, right, if you're there. And so while there may be staff people who you can get to because of technology, they also are dealing with their own lives, right? And so it's helpful to have a sister agency that will provide staff that have experts in voucher programs or in public housing programs who can step in and be of assistance to you and your organization. They may, though doubtful because of some of the same challenges we talked about, have resources that are available like units, right? And can help, as Felicia was saying earlier, they can, if they have already in their plan, their operating plan, that one of the priorities that they have for people who are served are disaster victims, right? And so you all can have that set up in sort of a reciprocity way, right? So if something bad happens to your community and your people were displaced for a while, then they can go into that community. Believe it or not, New Orleans helped in Hurricane, oh goodness, I forget, there have been so many, but hurricanes that affected Southwest Louisiana in the past 5 years. New Orleans is now still housing a bunch of the disaster victims from Lake Charles and places in Southwest
Was that
Louisiana.
Harvey? One of the HIM disasters? Harvey, Irma, Maria?
Yeah, Harvey was one of them that hit there, and there was another one. They had two in the same year in Louisiana, and they were both devastating. They hit the same community. And so what didn't get wiped out the first time practically all got wiped out the second time. And so that was critically important.
And I think one of the things that I recall from some of the Louisiana response was, first, the county did not count on coordinating when it came to evacuations with the PHA. And so then there was not a way to evacuate them. But they ended up reaching out and working with a PHA in Texas who assisted with the coordination and identifying a bus to come get their residents and bring them to Texas. So it was so important to have those relationships, not even just within the state, but in a geographical area that would be safer based on what type of peril and the geographic impact it was going to have. But that was all due to having a relationship prior to the event. And I believe it was the Houston
Yeah.
Housing Authority
Right.
that said, I'm going to get you here. I found you a bus. I'm going to get your residents, and you are going to come here, and we are going to put you in a hotel if we cannot house you here.
There's a reason why Mark is the head of NARO now. He was that was the housing authority head of NARO. Had a relationship with the housing authority executive director in St. Charles Parish, Louisiana. They both, I was the director of the housing recovery program after Hurricane Katrina called the Road Home Program. And they both worked with me, were two of my center managers during the Hurricane Katrina recovery. So they had that relationship and called, but that had nothing to do with anybody. In fact, the folks at the state were like, no, don't send the people out of the
I
state.
think they got pushback from some
Right.
HUD team members. on
Right,
that.
and even the HUD was like, why are you moving people out of the state? And Leatrice, God rest her soul, she passed away last year. Leatrice was just determined to make sure her people were taken care of
Yeah.
and did whatever. And like, okay, you can, I'd rather, beg for forgiveness than ask for permission. I'm doing the thing that's best for my people, right? And having that relationship with the housing authority in Houston was the best thing at that time for her and her people.
So what I'm hearing is identify a sister agency or authority and send them cookies at least once a year to develop this relationship. And so if there is to be an event, if nothing else, they'll remember you for your really good cookies. Ed?
Talking about neighboring housing authorities, we have a couple of neighboring housing authorities about the size of us. YOLO Housing Authority down between us and Sacramento. YOLO Housing had some migrant housing that was unused after the disaster. It was, it's only seasonally used. We reached out to them. One of the things here in terms of response is you'll find yourself doing many, many, many things, some of which work and some of which don't. Anyways, we reached out to YOLO. They reached out to us and they said, hey, we got some migrant housing. We can house some of your displaced people. Well, okay, great. Well, it turned out we only ever got 6 families to move down there because, again, the lesson learned. When you're working rural areas or you're working your community and your community members are displaced, they don't want to go anywhere else. They want to stay in your community.
Right.
This is their home over and over again.
One of the challenges I remember in Paradise is that they kept saying to us, there's a reason why they live in Paradise. These people do not want to deal with anybody. They don't even want to deal with the government, right? Yeah, so they were there for a reason. And the attitude, I mean, I've seen folks who are fiercely tied to their home in the area, but that attitude was overwhelming. Like even getting people to move out of some of those tents, right, into temporary shelter that might have been a little bit further away. And like, nope, I want to be near my community, even though the community was totally burnt down. Like it's just the fierce. Independence was another thing. It was like, I don't want your help, right? And getting people to identify and even register for FEMA assistance was a challenge, right? And that, I don't know if you have communities in this region that are the same way, but I'm telling you, having them to register, even if they refuse any type of assistance that's coming, feeds into numbers. From my role at HUD, we would literally look at the numbers of disaster victims in areas, what their demographics were, to make determinations about the amount of long-term funding that would be allocated. Oftentimes what Congress does is says, okay, since the last time there was a disaster allocation from Congress, these are all the places that are impacted. So you may, in your state, be competing with some place that's all the way in another part of the country,
Right.
Hawaii, whatever. And so, like, we're looking at the numbers of people who registered in the 2 months after the disaster. And if in that allocation may come 6, 7, 8 a year, 6, 7, 8 months, a year afterward. And it's too late for your folks to register, right? So those fiercely independent people in Butte County really were causing problems for themselves in the long term.
Well, I think what we deal with as well is, again, looking at those stakeholders, there are significant pockets of populations that do distrust the government, right? And even if they're within the Public Housing Authority and they're receiving some assistance, and I've seen lots of head shaking and nodding almost significantly, and so maybe it's when it comes to people of faith, being involved in those those houses of worship, and who are those leaders? Developing that relationship, because it might only be a pastor that can come in and have some of those conversations, or another community leader that if you partner with now, again, getting that buy-in with someone that they trust can go a long way.
So I want to, So talk about people who will live the property. Spokane, we had a gentleman, home burn. He set up a tarp over a hole, and that was his living situation because he wasn't leaving his property. So that's how far some people go. We got that guy out of his hole. We got him into some structures. But yes, I do fully agree, specifically with rural community. They don't want to. We just finished our IA delivery, individual assistance delivery, for the FEMA declaration in Spokane. And to the last community meeting, and we 60 days and multiple pushes. We had a guy sitting there, was like, asking us questions at the community meeting. We answered him correctly. It's like, okay, I'll go ahead and register. And he ended up getting $53,000. Not a huge amount, but $53,000 to help him on the road to recovery. And that's kind of the thing as we talk about programs that at least that we deal with. None of our programs are going to get anybody to whole. We're not getting any agency to whole, but the whole point is to spearhead that recovery, give them that leg up so they can move forward on the recovery process. There was one other piece there, but that was the big one, the hole. Somebody staying in the hole.
So again, this idea of what happens to people who are displaced. After our disaster, every campground, every hotel, every motel in the entire North State of California was occupied, either with those displaced by the disaster or by disaster recovery workers. Right after the disaster, there's an enormous population of recovery workers that come in, whether it's debris removal or engineers or whatever it is. All kinds of consultants come in to help, like Fred. And you got to put people like Fred, they got to put them someplace. So, so for 2 to 3 years, there was not a single room available in the entire North State of California because they were all occupied. This is unwound since, but
I had to
again,
drive 2 hours from the hotel I was staying in just to get to Butte County. And so if there was a 9 o'clock meeting,
so think in terms of your broader area. If a significant population, 10 or 20,000 people were displaced, where would they go? You need to be able to understand where they're going to go, because they will go somewhere. A lot of them will try to stay on their properties. In Paradise, one of the tricks, the local jurisdiction allowed campers on their own properties. That's a very tenuous affair, whether you're wet or dry camping. And the irrigation systems were all, or the water systems, the municipal water system was burned out with plastic junction boxes. So there's no way for people to live on their properties really very elegantly. That went on for about 2 years before the local jurisdiction unwound the availability, displacing a whole lot of other households. So where do people go?
And again, great. We're dealing with some of the same stuff on a slightly smaller scale. Spokane, people are still RV camping it, and then it was the environment. And Spokane gets really cold, so we set them up for RVs, got them reconnected to the wells, and then it got really cold. So how do we winterize these trailers now, and how do we do these different things? Those are the other considerations. If they want to be on the property, and we're going to support this population, that is now the population you serve now added, because there are people who meet your qualifications that were probably in a better stable condition, maybe financial otherwise, and now are not. So now you've added to your customer pool, is helping them out with that. But the community and the faith-based organization, that's huge, specifically for these rural communities. I don't know his last name, but he just goes by Pastor Jose, the Country Church of the Open Bible in the Elk community up in Spokane, north of Spokane. He has been a huge advocate for that community, because it's an unincorporated community, so no city or town, but they are a community. And so that pastor in that church has stood up and has been basically the lead member of that community, part of the long-term recovery group, building container shelters for people. So that's like, we talk about those other partners. And again, when I talk to people with disasters, there's a lot of voluntary agencies within any community. They get after any number of different things. Is it pet homelessness? Is it whatever it is? They're part. When a disaster happens, they generally all come to the table with some support for survivors. Right. So sometimes it's thinking outside the box. Hey, there's other organizations, volunteer organizations that don't necessarily deal in disaster space, but when a major disaster hits the community, they'll usually come to the table, and they'll bring stuff to the table to assist that you never thought of. Like, oh, we already have networks on this, or we can do this, we can support this option, or just sometimes it's people. They can throw people at your problem to help you with that part. So that's something to kind of just look at your other voluntary organizations and faith-based organization communities that maybe not helped you before, but can now.
Thank you. Any questions? Okay, whew, that's some heavy stuff. So we're going to talk a little bit about the recovery plan, or I'm sorry, the readiness plan, and really get into being more engaging. So I was very serious. I don't like feeling awkward, and we've done a lot of talking. So as I'm going to introduce the plan a little bit, and then I want to start talking about vulnerabilities. I would love audience engagement. I'd like to hear what you're hearing and how it applies to you. What vulnerabilities are you thinking about? So first, again, we have this disaster readiness plan. If you start with the contents and you look at the introduction, you'll start to get into information about earthquakes, wildfires. There's other incidents in here as well when it comes to extreme heat. I know hurricanes are not as much over here, but we do have still a lot of the significant windstorms, and if you're going to have wildfires, it's just as applicable. So please take time to think about and reviewing. We also have utility outage in here, something that may be as a result of an event or might be an isolated event. They talk about hazardous materials and chemical and biological. They talk about active shooter. As we heard, there was one actually here in 2017. What does that look like for your PHA? And so as you're reading through a little bit more about these incidents, think about which ones apply to you, the vulnerabilities you may or may not have, and how you would prepare for. There was a time when I think that there used to be a joke of, oh, if we only had a pandemic, or what that would look like. Well, then we had one, right? And how did that humble every single person? How much more proficient did we all get in Zoom and Teams? But in all seriousness, there was a lot of events that it would never happen to me until it happened. And what we're hearing from Joel specific in the Pacific Northwest is we're prepping, it's going to happen, it's just when. There is a little bit about here in shelter in place and lockdowns and what that might look like, but also talk to your local community to see if there are local shelters. But let's go ahead and get into a little bit more about that risk assessment. So I think it's on page 20, if you have it. If not, it's okay. You can just take notes and add to it later. This isn't true homework, but it is a guide. So who are your stakeholders? We've been talking a lot about that when we're talking with Ed and Joel and Fred mainly about who they've worked with, but there's a lot more in here. Who's your sheriff or deputy? Who are the council members? So that might be who's going to be your champion, because you have a population of active voters. And so that might be exactly why they care, whether it's today to get additional funding for mitigation, or if it's tomorrow because there's an event and you need them to pay attention. Looking at fire law and EMS, do you have relationships with some of those people and some of those leaders? Because if you do not, well, it's much easier if you already have their cell phone in your phone. And then which VOADs, or like I mentioned, VOADs or COADs that are local to your area: American Red Cross, United Way, Catholic Charities. I'm not endorsing, but there's a long list. Those are just the ones that are involved in most disasters. I'm sure you saw all of them, Ed.
One
yeah.
note is interesting. In 1989, after the Loma Prieta earthquake in Santa Cruz,
Yeah.
The housing authority down there, similar to the Camp Fire disaster, was not the center of, how should I say, recovery activity. But the Red Cross did come in and give the housing authority $1.5 million, which the housing authority parlayed into a development pipeline of 300 units, which is really kind of cool. It stands in stark contrast to the Camp Fire disaster, where no organization came in. I mean, here it is, a disaster that's all about housing. You'd think that the housing authority might actually be, this might be the center of attention for some reason, but no one came in with any money, any resources, anything. So our recovery was completely self-generated. And we had a lot of interested folks looking in the fishbowl, but no one swimming in the tank with us.
Thank you. So Joel and Ron as well, I want to start talking about vulnerabilities. Talk me through a little bit of what you think about when it comes to doing a risk assessment, even just starting with a mental one, not even a formal one, and then walking through even some lessons learned of didn't think about that, and how you'd want to put that back into moving forward as a lessons learned.
So it really, what is your disaster profile? I think it talks about, there's acronyms, and I can't even tell you what they stand for, but HIVA and THIRA, and so if you talk to your EMs, they'll know them, so the other EMs shake his head. These are your hazard assessments. It's basically how likely is that disaster to affect your community or location, and then what is the impact of that. So, and those are updated frequently, and so those are getting those copies, and they're reported through FEMA, and there's national level ones, state level ones, local level ones. So really it's looking at your disaster profile and your threat assessment. Like, what are your threats? So wildfire generally is higher threat in the eastern side of Washington versus the west, but that's changing. Where earthquakes, we talk about earthquakes primarily focused on the west side of the state, but we do have fault lines on the east side of the state as well. So really looking at those profiles, and then from that, then what is your side of that plan? You know what I mean? Like how, like when we talk about wildfire, do you have the right step-offs? So you're looking at your facilities, like trees are too close to the buildings, and those kind of considerations. Is your property earthquake stable? Is it an older home? Is there unreinforced masonry involved there? Is it seismic safe or other things? Really, you got to look at your profiles, and it really depends on your area. Some areas, and you could have a jurisdictions on the hills, and you could deal with all of them, including flooding and tsunami risk. So, just really look at those profiles and how they affect your different properties, and then kind of planning for that. Like some things are fiscally requirements, like to really get after things. We're talking about mitigation and long-term efforts to improve the infrastructure that we manage, is looking at, okay, so hey, identify those and start working to maybe funding those or finding those funding streams. But also then, like, okay, in the interim, what do we do? Like, is it improved evacuation, improved information to the populace? Is it coordination with your locals? Because, hey, I have maybe a home that's got a lot of disabled people, so I need to make sure that the fire department knows that. So if we are evacuated, I'm going to need additional assistance to get a lot of people who can't take the elevator's off.
Right.
So I need people to help people get down the stairs. And coming from a healthcare background, I've done a lot of carrying people up and down stairs when they had to evacuate. But it is a thing to consider. So that's kind of you nest. You got to find out what your hazards are, see what the plans are for the community, and then what are the specific considerations you need to make at your local level, and document that. You know what I mean? And it doesn't have to be like a set in stone thing, because no plan survives first contact. So and I say, like, coming to the military side, hey, no plan survives first contact with the enemy. And this is like no plan survives the actual disaster. You know what I mean? But it's just a starting point. And you look at your specific situation, and I think it was mentioned earlier, you adjust your plans as needed at the time, but you have a baseline to go off. You ask the certain questions in the right order.
I have a question for the audience, and Zoom, I'm calling you out as well. So gentlemen, if you can just let me know how many people virtually raise their hand. How many people have buildings less than 10 years old? Less than 10 years old first. Okay. How many people have buildings older than 10 years old? Older than 20? Older than 30? Older than 40? Older than 50? Okay, we're going to go to 60. Older than 70? Older than 80? Older than 90? Older, we have one still. Is there any on Zoom that are older than 90? Okay, so we have closer to almost 100-year-old buildings. So when we're talking about vulnerabilities, and we are talking about building codes, and we're talking about how we're going to navigate these buildings, and then you deal with, if it's older than 50, SHPO comes in, man, State Historic Preservation Office, if you touch anything. And so what does that look like? What does it look like for mitigation, and what happens? Is it up to code, or has it kind of been grandfathered in, and what are you doing about it? That scares me, especially when we talk about earthquakes. Yes?
I just wanted to point something out. So it seems like, tell me if I'm wrong, we're all over the map on size here.
Yes.
Like, I have 33,000 people just in my business. Like, within Seattle. So the one thing that I'll comment on is state, and I apologize, you talked about it sort of at the local level, but a lot of the counties and states are often legally required to make a lot of plans that make the locals.
Yes.
Just connecting to those people to say, hey, local emergency management, you're required by federal regulation now that has a mitigation plan. They've done the research, they've paid consultants way too much money to come tell them stuff. A lot of
True.
that stuff is available online for free. Like, this is a good like template, but if you have money to do it, there's a lot of people out there that will help you.
Correct.
Give you copies of their information, or even just sit there and have coffee with people. Like, hey, my building's 100 years old, how does that affect me? I don't know.
Right.
The local emergency management people follow.
And some of those are the federal funds that are available for you. When it comes to hazard mitigation funds for building codes and standards, being able to stabilize your structure, or sometimes it's retrofitting certain rooms within the building that they can go to for a shelter in place if required, are options for you if you have those plans. And even some of these are also federal funds and grants to bring in a consultant or someone else to be able to walk through it, whether it's an engineer or whomever else, to be able to identify additional grant funds or other opportunities. That's also important. Personally, I specialize also in federal funding and grant compliance, so if you have any questions, please let me know when we get to recovery and even mitigation. But some of it's doing the procurement now, to have people on, to have vendors on or consultants on that you may or may never trigger the contract. It's just getting the contract on in the event something happens, because that's another issue that happens at post-disaster is if you do not have them on contract, whether it's debris, whether it's federal funding and consulting, whether it's disaster recovery, whether it's power and generators, those resources are going to be bought up. And so it's important to also think about positioning those contracts now and putting in there being a penalty clause if they don't show up. And that's something Florida has really experienced a lot of. Granted, every June and November someone sneezes and there's another hurricane, and so they've had to do that because especially in the southeast, when it comes to debris contractors and others, they're all getting on contract. They pick up their phones and they're like, sorry, you're number 10 on the list. I understand we have a contract. And so it's also getting in, now there's a lot of the entities in Florida put in penalizations. They do not show up.
So, and then with that, as we talk about, like, you don't necessarily have to have those contracts yourself. Just find out who does. Because at the state, we have certain contracts for certain things like debris management. We've done that in the past. Other, like, shelter resources and things. But there are different contracts at different levels can be activated, either county or just. So just find out if you have a gap. Again, is there already somebody's got a plan for it, and then can I partner in with it? And that's maybe then an MOU with you and maybe another county or another jurisdiction that they'll provide that support through their mechanism.
But that's a great example when it comes to housing. I mean, it's great that if you have someone on contract now, but again, if you don't structure the contract in a way that they're going to be held accountable, it's, well, you're number 13 on the list for wanting 27 units, so get to you when I get to you. But when they came in and sold it to you, they're like, we'll be there within 24 hours. And this is everything we're going to give you.
And they were. They sent one guy with a computer.
So those are the things to be thinking about now, again, when we're talking about readiness. So at this point, let's talk a little bit more about vulnerabilities. What questions do you have? And also, what are you hearing that you're like, I didn't think about that, or I'm going to go back? I'm happy to start calling names, but then it gets awkward, so.
It's got.
Brittany? It's just a thought here. One of the things, touching on what the gentleman back here said, you know, the size of our agency and the size of our jurisdiction makes a lot of difference in terms of our ability to prepare and our ability to respond. My agency is such a size, we're about 3,000 units altogether between Section 8 and the units we own and manage. We don't have a lot of depth on our staff. We don't have a lot of depth to be doing deep dives on plans. So we rely on a different kind of resilience. And I know you guys know what I'm talking about. The little teeny housing authorities, there might be an executive director that does everything. Okay, there you go. So, and so you have to be master of the universe, and you have very limited resources. You need to pick and choose what hills to die on. Whereas a larger authority, if I was working for a large city, I'd say, oh, you go make me a disaster preparedness plan. I want to see a draft in a month, and it would be delivered to your desk. So that's sort of the extremes we're working with. In our agency, we try to be practical, given our resources. We don't have time to do these formal disaster preparedness plans. But I think, you know, if you listen to the conversation, embedded in our thinking and our culture are what you would normally have in a disaster preparedness plan. Also, capitalize on what Joel said, you know, in our local county, we have a disaster coordinator. Well, they have disaster plans. What happens when the power goes down or when the infrastructure goes down? We piggyback with, and we partner with all these agencies, so we don't have to do all of it. We stay in our silo. Our silo is housing. But we partner with all the agencies that complete the picture.
And something Joe said earlier, those emergency management officers and officers have by responsibility, in order to get funding, have a requirement to do regular exercises, right? You all should be a part of the exercises. Call them, say, hey, the next time you plan an exercise to respond for a disaster, we want to be a part of it. We want to be at the table. We want to be a participant. That's a great way to learn who all the players are at the local level, and what they would do, you know, in this imagined scenario that might be just like, or a lot like the actual scenario that happens.
So just real quick, Alex and Chris with Alaska, were you both around for the 2018 earthquake with the Housing Authority?
I can't respond because my name is not Alex.
Oh, sorry.
I'm Greg, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
Hi. Yes, we were there and we were he was on the road, I was in the building. And, you know, I think the biggest takeaway from that is people that you think are strong leaders might just be scaredy cats, right? Mm-hmm. So the main thing is you got to tell people, you know, you got to stay calm. And I had folks that, you know, big, robust, tough running out the building and never stopped. Some of them never even came back.
Still going.
Yeah, I mean, and it's like, we're in a glass building. Be smart. Use common sense. And what we found in a lot of those types of situations is, you have a plan, but cooler heads and common sense are invaluable.
Right.
Okay,
That was my deal.
yeah, no, that makes sense.
And then like 40 minutes later, I checked on my wife. She was fine.
I'm so glad she was okay for you.
One of the unique things about Alaska is we basically have one highway in and one highway out wherever you go. And so I'm driving along, I was on my way to some training that morning, and purple and blue explosions are going up in the sky, and okay, this is weird. Truck started swinging all over the road. I pulled over and I just sat there like this. Like, okay, this isn't too bad. But then the phone calls started coming in.
Yeah.
Hey, this is happening, this is happening. I was stuck in traffic for almost 3 hours before I could actually get back to my home and check on it because of the way the traffic was there. I was on my way in, everybody freaked out, and they were on their way out. And I was like, oh.
So from like a risk assessment perspective, what did you not anticipate being a vulnerability? Other than it sounds like having one way in and one way out.
Definitely the infrastructure.
But we have a pretty robust building code, and we have the 64 earthquake, which really, it's like you look at our building code department, and it's like, well, they're a pain. Well, for good reason, and we didn't have a lot of damage in our building. We had some file cabinets that opened up and stuff like that. Pots flew down, maybe a little bit of ceiling grid, but I mean, we're like inside of a couple of days, we're back, and I think that the building codes were a strong component of that.
Well, that's
And
great
then
to
people
hear.
didn't fuel up their vehicles, right? So we had long lines at the fueling stations. It's like, this is why you say half a tank, fill it up,
So what does that look like for everyone when it comes to having access to fuel and energy? And how often do you prepare for that? Is it,
Proactive and not reactive.
yeah, if it takes you 6 hours to get here, how close are your closest gas stations?
So just a comment to Chris. So here we are driving on a highway in Alaska, a disaster happens. And, disasters can be drilled down to a very micro scale. Did you have a sleeping bag and provisions in your car?
I did have some provisions in my car, yes.
Okay.
Not probably the most robust bag, but yeah, I had blankets, flares,
And
things
handy
like
bar.
that. Yeah, I had emergency food, water. I did have that stuff. It's kind of like standard if you live in Alaska, especially in the winter.
Yeah.
I think that, the fact that we're all here today, we're talking about this. And so whether you're a large housing authority or small housing authority, having for lack of a better word, a planning event where you're talking about these things. And I default back to know thyself. You know your properties, you know your agency, you know your staff, you know the kinds of things that could come your way. So the earthquake, the wildfire, it's a known unknown. It's coming, you just don't know when, right? So my imaginary world has a room like this with whiteboards all the way around, and we're talking about what would happen if. And you take the time to sort of plan out from the epicenter out. So best case scenario, it's very contained, it's very close. And then as the ripple goes out, the likelihood of such a severe disaster, it takes the whole state and dislodges it out into the ocean. There's nothing we can do about it. Call your loved ones. So you start looking at some of the probabilities of what's the probability of that happening, what's the impact of it happening, and you start developing plans like in our guide. The guide is really a discussion point, I think, between you and your agency, and you're documenting some things. And as you're getting input from different perspectives internally and externally, you're like, oh, I never thought about that. What are we going to do with these people or in this event? How do we find housing in a place where we just lost all our housing? So I think the exercise of today and tomorrow are really good to take back. Again, regardless of the size of your agency, maybe you're having a conversation with 2 people, maybe it's 10. But you're assessing those things. So as simple as we have a policy to fuel up our vehicles every night before we go home. Something like that, the just in cases. So you make that part of your, Ed said it well, it's a culture of preparedness, of readiness. You know, what are the things that we're doing? Like you're talking about landscaping and things like that. Again, in my perspective, it's a village. You know, your readiness for a disaster is 24/7. You're always talking about it. It's a conscious part of how you staff. We'll talk about IT systems here in a second. How you design your systems, how you coordinate with your teams, whether or not you have a policy to give cell phones to people just in case you need to get a hold of them. So it becomes a much more conscious, everyday effort than, you know, once every 5 years we're going to sit down and have a disaster planning event. It becomes part of your everyday. And again, Ed mentioned it, you know, housing, we deal with many disasters on the daily. But the more that I think that you can put together a plan and it's in the consciousness of people and it's practiced, it's something that you're going to be able to respond to in the best foot forward.
So, no.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was going to go back a couple of things. So we talked about earlier the tabletop exercises. And so you'll hear the term tabletop exercise, and that's probably the best one for you guys to get in, because that's just usually a group of people, all your POCs in a room with a map, you know what I mean, some whiteboards. And it's really just kind of walking through the plan or the disaster thing. And that's where you have a chance to say, well, in this scenario, I'm going to have 200 people to relocate. You know what I mean? And so that's kind of the planning factor. Because me at the state level, I don't have the numbers. Okay, how many vulnerable populations do I have? How many necessarily people on the ground? That's where you can kind of facilitate with your locals and hire a lot of times too. Like, hey, if we have this type of event, there's going to be this many people affected, and kind of getting those better estimates with these kind of specialty needs. So that's going to get those tabletop exercises versus full-scale exercise. Not much, sometimes a little bit of difference there, but for your level might not be, because you might be, versus you actually evacuating people. But I always love the thing, if you have to do an evacuation fire drill in a group facility, coordinate it with one of these events, because you're actually trying to move people. And if you get the people, you plan it out, get people buy-in, you can actually try to move. What happens if you have to take 70 residents out of a facility at one time? You know what I mean? They have limited mobility. So those are the kind of things you can kind of inject, you can throw into those exercises that maybe at the state level I've never thought about. Well, that's a whole different problem set. I need to bring ambulances or buses with special equipment, those type of things. But also we talked about too, we talked about fueling vehicles. We're gone to electric vehicles, King County and others. So this has been a kind of a infrastructure thing I try to say, is that where are your charging stations on the priority list for repowerization? Because that is a big problem, so that's a bit to say. But yeah, I have electric vehicles, but if I can't charge them, and most electric charge stations are low on the priority list, so you got to make sure that if you have electric vehicles, you have sufficient charge capabilities, and they're part of the grid, they're on your backup power as well as your buildings, if you have emergency power. Those are something to consider, because then you can't go anywhere and you can't do much. That's all you have is electric vehicles.
I was just going to add to that very point, we're looking at solar charging and building up our capacity so that we don't have to rely on electricity. And we've got battery power distributed across our property portfolios, and that those vehicles can quickly be able to recharge. One other thing, just very quickly, generally about fleet, is that we just recently made a major change to our fleet policy, and we're allowing employees in our housing management department to commute with their vehicles. And so what that means is essentially that in the event of a significant natural disaster, we've got vehicles distributed all over the county rather than parked at our properties, just sitting overnight. And that way employees have those vehicles at their front doors. They can immediately commute either into their work site or be deployed to the place where we most need them. So
I think, you know, again, to that point, very specifically, you know, I think a lot of times in the Housing Authority, we silo our policies. Like, should I let my people drive a car, their own car, and how do I do that? And the finance people are like, yeah, but that's going to do this or that in insurance. And when you contextualize it into a disaster context, a broader context, you're like, that distributes my ability to respond to things differently. How do we make it work, not what are the barriers to getting it there? So again, in my fictitious whiteboard world, having the group of people in the room to talk through those angles, the benefits of those things with a can-do, how do we make this happen attitude, to see what you can push the boundaries on to make it work.
So as we're talking about kind of planning and thinking of vulnerabilities, we talk about relationships, but also relationship with your electeds or decision makers within your communities, and what are their authorities. So some jurisdictions set it up with the county sheriff in an emergency has a lot of authority and can pretty much start signing checks, start paying funds out of emergency accounts. But then you have other jurisdictions which it has to go to a full committee meeting and it has to be scheduled. It can take a while. Sometimes you have to get, hey, emergency meeting to get the county commissioners together to approve stuff. So really understanding where you're at in your jurisdiction specifically, how does that work? So if you have specific needs, is it something that an individual can approve? Does it have to be a council to approve certain actions or assistance? And then what that process, so you have a better understanding. So just kind of understanding your local political landscape and what's needed to move things across. Because even at the state level, I can't put certain resources to bear until I have an agreement. I have to have the county accept it or request it. So it's making sure that they understand how do they request it, how do they approve maybe a contract, emergency funding authorizations. That kind of understanding some of that process in your local jurisdictions will be beneficial to you as well.
Again, the point you bring up is relationships. So we're privileged. We get to work with a lot of executive directors and people across the country, and you'll see some that are very well networked, and you'll see some that are recluse. They're not well connected with their political leaderships, maybe not the COC. And this is one of those things, my proverb for the day is the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago. The second best time is today. So if you're not engaging your community and the partners, the people that help you do the affordable housing, and there's a myriad of different organizations, again, the political groups, the realtor groups, if you're not well connected with them, today's the day to start, because we end up in a situation like this that we need to lean on people, other housing authorities, people in our community. Building that relationship in a hurry would have been better had you had a longer run at it. They know you, you have this relationship where you can call upon them for resources or help or guidance or other networking even to be able to connect you with people that you need help with. Critical for something like this.
Thank you, Ron. And let's just pivot for a second and go into IT when it comes to vulnerabilities. Outside of, yes, we know that right now cybersecurity is a huge concern, but even outside of that, in the day-to-day, if we were to have a natural disaster, what are the concerns? What have you seen? What do you recommend?
IT umbrella. So as I mentioned, I kind of crossed over from IT into the operational side of things, and my perspective on IT was a little different. My educational background was business, so I fell into IT. I wasn't like born into it. So IT is a service delivery component of your housing authority, and depending on how broad you make that, it can be everything from servers to networks to internet. It could be mobile phones. It could be the security systems on your building. It could be elevator controls. It really depends on kind of how you carve that up. So the IT vulnerability in and of itself, there's two different veins of it from my perspective. One is the infrastructure component. So what does that look like in terms of again, my server farm? I have a system of record. Is that in the cloud or is it not in the cloud? So if it is in a basement of an old building that's likely to flood, if we have a disaster, that's probably a bad plan. So again, the longer running perspective of this discussion is where are my vulnerabilities? So my systems, my equipment, my staff's ability to support it. If it goes down, if one of those components goes down, how do I recover? So it even crosses over into things like the document management. So have I gone to paperless, which means I use 20% more paper than I did before. Do I have electronic documents that are available to me? Can I keep running? In a very twisted way, the pandemic was a really good thing for us because, one, we didn't have time to properly figure it out. We had to have it up and running Monday. But we were able to mobilize services. So I have infrastructure on one side in IT, the business functions and services that I provide in partnership with my agency It's my website. It's my ability to do a re-exam. It's HAP payments. It's accounts payable. It's accounts receivable. Those are the services that IT partner with. And when we look at the discussion of a disruption of service, it's all of those things. So I have Section 8 program. We have a disaster. How do I pay those landlords? Because that's going to be coming up. They need to get paid. And so when you look at the combination of these, the supported services, for instance, we'll start with my networks and things like that. This is that whiteboard exercise again. So executive directors, when IT is mentioned, don't go run hide. Instead, bring your CFO and your checkbook. Because what we need to do is build redundant paths for our internet. So if our internet goes down, that's our connection to the world. That's how we're going to communicate. We're delivering services through our website. We're taking applications, maybe providing work order information, inspection information to people, maybe even disaster, like here's where we are, here's what we're trying to work through, broadcasting information. So if I have a primary pipeline and it's broken, now I have a problem. Back to the working remote. So if my staff can't get into my central office, if my central office has been compromised, can I continue those remote services? So don't shelf those. Use those to augment what you have available to you to deliver services to your residents. Keep them ready, keep them functioning, so that should I need to be able to do remote services through my staff, they can't get to me, but they do have internet access. Now I have a way to continue those services. I have a way to communicate. So again, the wraparound policies of things like considerations. Who are my key staff? Should I lose functionality, I need to, this will be in your plan, I need to identify who those key staff people are. What are the critical functions that we have to be able to restore quickly? And the consideration on that, as we were doing our whiteboard planning of this, remember I talked about epicenter out. So if I look at this, when the disaster happens, is it at the first of the month when I'm doing my check run? Does it happen to hit over payroll? Will it last through a month cycle of things that I do? That's all part of that matrix of decision making that you're going to put together in your plan that said, if this happens in the middle of the month, Section 8, for instance, I don't have a check run, I already did it, I'm good to the end of the month, I can delay things, I can do whatever, but I don't have a check run to go out. If it happens at the first of the month, end of the month, somewhere in there, now I have to deal with that. Payroll, what do I do with payroll? So again, understanding not only the infrastructure of your systems, again, EDs, if your systems are older, if they're in-house, there's a vulnerability that you have to look at in terms of just the physical protection of that device. Do you have battery backups on things like your internal network pieces? Laptops and things like that. Do people have laptops or desktop computers? Are they mobile? Are they not mobile? So again, when you get a little granular with IT, those are some of the things that, again, you need to look at in the perspective of if I have disruption of service, what is it going to cost me in terms of getting those ready? The other part of that is depending on your IT team, maybe you have that outsourced to a managed service provider. So we need to know logins, passwords, phone numbers of people that are going to be able to help us restore those services should they go down. Again, this is that little leather binder that's in the glass case outside of the executive's office. It's electronic too. So that if we get into a situation where we need to have access to be able to reset up things, we actually have that. We know where it is, we know who the right people are, we have phone numbers, contacts, and have that expectation. Again, I like that of that non-performance as well. And making sure that, again, as you're having the discussions with those service providers that are helping you do those things, that you talk about what happens if, where are we in the hierarchy if, things go bad in the area, how bad are they? The backups, again, we talk about things like the backups. So in our current system, we back up our data every 2 hours. So you may back up daily, you may have a rotation of backups of your data. Make sure you know what it is. So if you lose something, how far back do I have to go to recreate it? Pushing the tolerance towards your transactional volume. You're going to know about how many transactions you're going to miss in a day. If you miss 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 8 hours, how much are you going to have to be able to recreate? Again, CFOs, EDs, this is the checkbook exercise. You're going to be able to afford something. You may not be able to afford instantaneous, but you may be able to afford 1 day backup, something like that. And even in light of that, the other design consideration, again, we've talked about some of the things like architecture of our buildings, the architecture of your network even. So if you're in the cloud, maybe you have a primary place where your data is, and then you have a rollover in case that primary location goes down. So at our office, we have a East Coast, our office is in Bethesda. We have a data center, it's AWS in the cloud, in the East Coast. So if something goes dark on the East Coast, guess what? We have a West Coast cousin that is a clone of ours that we can spin up in about 20 minutes and be operational again for our staff. So again, your large housing authority or small housing authority, take a look at what you can do, but know what that limitation and that vulnerability is in terms of that decision point and what it's going to cost you to get there. The service side of it, again, this is one of those war room discussions you're going to have with your finance people, your payables, your HR, your Section 8, your public housing. What are those critical services that we're providing? So obviously we have accounts payable, so we have to pay our vendors of things that we're doing. We have HR, so we're payroll, we're paying people that work for us. We have half runs that we're doing. Maybe we have first of the month, mid-month, kinds of things. So you start looking at what those critical functions are and what do I need to have stood up in my background. Again, granular, who needs to show up, who's running check runs, who's approving, how do we get it through, how do we get through banking, is that going to be an issue to get electronic payments out if I'm still doing checks, but the paper got burned up in the basement or flooded in the basement, now I can't print checks. So this is one of those where, again, you're sitting down in a room with your staff and you're talking about that disruption. What am I going to do? Who needs to be available? How do we do it? Payroll was one that was interesting. As we were going through our plan, we called our payroll people. We were paying for a service. And I was the IT guy at the time, and I said, hey, we're doing some business continuity planning. If we go down, tell me what the process is of how you would support us, blah, blah, blah. They say, I cannot even talk to you because you're not the point of contact on this account. It's your finance director. So they would not tell me in general terms, in specific terms. They would not tell me anything about what that process looked like. And the lesson learned of that was understanding those relationships before I had to. I needed to know what I was going to get into, how to restore those, who to call. What if my finance director, God help her, something happened to her and she was unavailable? And I said, well, what if the ED was calling? He's like, I still can't answer your call. So again, to Ed's point, planning is the boss. If we're talking about what this continuity plan looks like, it's the planning part of it that then makes execution easier. You're going to have to adapt it, of course, because you don't know what really is going to hit you, but the absence of a plan is a problem.
Thank you, Ron. I think, so I actually want to segue this a little bit, and it's going to touch on both. Kenton, just because I can't see you doesn't mean I forgot about you. So talking about where we're at with IT and what that backup might look like, if a wildfire or an earthquake happens tomorrow and everything is gone, who has a digital inventory of everything that they are responsible for? So when it comes to if your building collapses or disappears because of a fire, who is prepared to contact their insurance and prove what has been lost? I don't see many hands. This is really nerve-wracking, Kenny, and I think this is a great
I don't have insurance, but I have a list.
So what does that list look like? Are there pictures to show that it was maintained, to show which model it was, how much it may or may not be worth? And with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Kenton to talk a little bit about insurance and what's important for readiness.
Actually, can I touch on that real quick before we touch insurance? So when we talk about it, we'll talk about it some later, is that after things with damage, we talk about mitigation. There's other funding on the rebuild side for your, like, not the houses specifically, where it's got to be publicly owned, under public assistance. So maintenance records are very important, because if you want to apply for federal assistance to get something rebuilt, they want to know that prior to it was maintained. So I do want to have that as a key point. If you have those archived, send them to digital clouds someplace else so you can get to them later, because that'll be needed if we want to try to get federal funding to rebuild.
Yeah,
How far back do you have to have?
the biggest thing is showing that it's most recently maintained
Yeah,
is
so
like
we're still saying-
critical.
Yeah.
Within the last year?
Well, you have to have a maintenance, general for that is a maintenance plan and some documentation of maintenance. Most of these things, like, you can use your inspections of your facility specifically.
Yep.
Equipment, like the computer, that's like, but you were talking about more like real property or other major, like a bridges. Hey, when was the bridge last maintained? Was there an inspection? You can use that. And what was
Right.
your maintenance plan?
They want to make sure that the last time you didn't touch that bridge was 20 years ago, and now you're trying to claim it, and ask for a brand new, exactly how it would be beautiful, pristine bridge.
And
But
I'm
what-
sure Ken's going to touch on this, but doing things like taking pictures, sending a drone up to take a picture of your roof, right? So you can prove if there's a bad storm coming through that you maintained your roof and you checked it on a regular basis. But just one point. The reason one of the reasons we suggest going through your plan is because you want to identify single points of failure, right? What are the things in your operations that have a single point of failure? Not having redundancy on who the point of contact is a single point of failure, right? Not having a list of all of your residents who are the owners who you make cap payments to, not having that somewhere that's backed up that you can get to remotely, single point of failure, right? And so you just really go through, think about those things, and then how would you create the redundancy that's necessary to, and we're gonna get to Coop, but in a second, yeah.
So Kenton, how often should we take a GoPro and walk through our facilities?
Well, from the looks of the hands that didn't come up, you should do that immediately. So it's really critical, and this is a problem, and I want to back up and say, first of all, as I said at the outset, our association and the insurers I work with are in the homeowners market and the commercial insurance market. But the insurance typically that you are purchasing is probably from the specialty lines market, which we don't have any specialty lines members. But there are correlations between the work that I do and the kind of information we try to get out to people about preparedness as well as mitigation, and I can speak a little bit to both. While I'm going to say that first and foremost, there are two things that you need to do. You need to have your insurance broker or someone in your organization know who your insurance broker or agent or company is and have them on speed dial. And you need to talk with them at least annually, if not a couple times a year, not just at renewal, but at some other point in the year, to review your coverages and ask a lot of questions about what ifs. We've heard a lot of examples of things that can happen, from flood risk to earthquake risk to wildfire risk to convective storm activity. We had a tornado in Washington about 5 years ago that did some significant damage. And a lot of times these things occur without warning, and we are facing a dramatic increase in wildfire threat. When we were talking earlier about Western Washington, I mean, those of you who are from Eastern Washington, yay, Eastern Washington in the house. I grew up in Wenatchee and Leavenworth area. The wildfire threat is growing here for not only reasons that were mentioned, but also we're actually in a drought right now. The El Nino period that's been in Washington for the last couple of years is probably going to let up in the fall. So we'll probably see a wetter winter next year and more snowpack, and that will all be good. But right now, we're in a drought all over the state with a couple of minor exceptions for the immediate, Puget Sound region. The rest of the state's in a drought condition, according to the National Weather Service. So those things are all impacting in the wildfire threat. So, but going back to what you were asking about, so what I tell people who own businesses and homes all the time is the more information that you have available after something happens, the easier your claim process is going to go. So you can make it really easier on yourself, or you can make it really hard on yourself. If you have no inventory of the structure and the things inside of it, that's going to make it harder for you to get a speedy and full settlement when you file your insurance claim. So it's really critical to do that, and it can be as simple as walking around with a smartphone and taking video and commenting on the video about what you know about the items that you're filming. How long, when was this purchased? Do you have a copy of the receipt of the purchase? Do you know what its value was when it was purchased? And if you do that one time and you store that digitally in the cloud, you don't have to worry that the pictures you took are lost in a fire or some other disaster. And then once that, that big job is done, you should update it as new things are purchased for the facility. And the other things that need to be done in terms of how you protect yourself, and I want to again back up, I can speak a lot about what's going on with the insurance industry right now, and I know that you're feeling the hardest end of it. I know that availability is a significant issue, and I know that affordability is a significant issue. If you can get coverage, you're probably seeing less of it than you had before, and you're probably paying a lot more for it. And the reason that's happening is because it's the same problem across the country. I was just reading an article that came out today in the New York Times that I think in like 6 or so states, insurers have lost billions of dollars over the last 3 years. And it's due to climate change related weather events. It's convective storms, which are hailstorms, tornadoes, windstorms, weather related storms. And in the West, it's wildfire. And in the Gulf Coast and in Florida, it's hurricanes. These things are happening at an unprecedented level, and they are insured losses. So insurance companies are having to respond to those, pay out more money. And we're talking about companies that have built up reserves over the last 30 years when these things weren't necessarily happening, and seeing those reserves wiped out in a year, wiped out in a single fire season. So then they have to figure out how they're going to survive. They're either going, and by the way, a piece of the insurance business that people don't really think about or know about is reinsurance. Insurance companies buy insurance to protect themselves too, so that once a certain threshold of loss has been reached, of payouts has been reached, the reinsurance program kicks in. Sometimes reinsurance is available for self-insured organizations, and for insurers and self-insured organizations that rely on reinsurance, they're seeing the same problem. Reinsurance costs more and you get less coverage for it. That's just the state of that market right now. So, all of this is to say, the more that you can do in the mitigation space, in the preparation space, the less risky a customer you appear to be to the insurance companies. So, the better thought out your plan is, the more infrastructure protection you have against cybersecurity related losses. The more work you do in mitigation, I think about Okanagan County a lot. If you're connected to the Firewise community and you're thinking about defensible space, there are other programs too that I can go into a little bit more, but the more you think about ways to mitigate your potential for loss, you probably aren't affecting your premium, but you are improving your ability to remain insured and to keep the level of coverage that you've had in the past. And the less of those things that you do, the more risky, the higher your risk. And what insurance companies are doing right now is they're raising premiums dramatically, and they are retracting from markets because they see themselves as being overexposed. And the bigger problem with that is it's a little bit domino-esque, because when a large insurer pulls out of a market, that leaves the remaining risks on a smaller number of companies, and then they get nervous, so they pull back. It's a problem that I hope is going to peak soon, and that insurers will start to re-enter markets that they have been pulling back from. But it's happening all across the country. It's happening in places you wouldn't expect it to happen, like Iowa. It's happening in Arkansas. It's happening all across the country. And here in the Northwest, Washington, Oregon, and Idaho, although it is not as significant as it is elsewhere in the country, we have seen some of this happen here. Large companies saying, we're either going to non-renew some policies or we're going to not write new policies for new customers. So for people in the private home market, this has a ripple effect whether you're trying to sell your house and you can't sell it because the buyer can't find insurance, or you're having trouble insuring your home, or you're having trouble building a home, and all these things are affecting the larger housing economy, which can affect all of you as well. So it's a pretty intricate web of how these things all interact with each other, and insurance is a big part of it. And I think the companies are looking for ways to look to the future so that we move from an environment of, I think, Brittany, you said it earlier, the difference between only you can prevent forest fires is now, you have to mitigate against forest fires. And what our society has to figure out is how to build in and think about resilience and living with wildfire, not assuming we can stop it. Stopping it is kind of what helped lead to the situation we have now, where we have forests that are overloaded with tinder dry fuel. We used to call them forests, now we call it fuel load, because that's what it is. I'll also just mention briefly, there is a program at the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety, which is an insurance industry supported research organization. They do the crash test dummies, as an example, but they also have a huge facility out in the Midwest where they test for hail and fire and wind and hurricane, and they've developed a couple of industry-approved standards for mitigation, especially in the hurricane space to start with, the Fortified Home Project.
Yes.
And now they've expanded that to wildfire, the Wildfire Prepared Home. You can look that up, wildfireprepared.org, I think is the name of it. And there are good instruction in there for how to build defensible space and what are the most important things to do to build in resilience. Again, particularly in Washington, Washington I think is the only state where insurers are not even allowed to give a discount for FireWise participation. That's a complication from the insurance department that I won't go into, because I like my friends at the insurance department. But contrary to popular belief. But in most other states there are discounts available. It's still important to consider things like wildfire prepared home and FireWise communities, because those are smart tips that again might make you more insurable compared to somebody else. So that's just a little starter. So where do you want me to go from here?
Well, I want to open it up for questions, and I saw people peeking. Go for it.
Do we have data on how, if a PHA has lost insurance and not been able to reinsure, and how does that impact that?
So do we have data if PHAs have lost being able to be insured, and how does that impact, correct?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer to that. I don't think we do have data, but I'm glad you asked that question, because I was going to mention that there was legislation passed this last session, House Bill 2329, that requires the Office of the Insurance Commissioner to conduct a study of availability and affordability of insurance for publicly supported housing authorities. In particular, the wording was applicable housing providers, which would be providers that receive housing trust fund resources. But I think that's going to be a more expansive look than just that specific area of funding. So there were actually two pieces of legislation. That was the bill. There was also a budget proviso in the state budget to study insurance availability for adult family homes. I just talked with the insurance department yesterday to sort of get an update. It sounds like they're going to get that study started in June, so they'll be reaching out to stakeholders. I would encourage you, if you have a strong interest in that, I don't know who will be appointed to actually serve on the task force that will do the study, but that will be open to the public. So anyone will be able to view the meetings as they occur and get updates and provide provide written or probably sometimes oral testimony as well. They'll be looking to hear stories about the availability issues that PHAs are having across the state, and they'll be looking for potential answers. A couple of which might include the establishment of a market of last resort, kind of a fair plan specifically for these, or a reinsurance pool where after a certain amount of loss, much like the reinsurance idea, the state, maybe a state fund could kick in. That, again, these would be incentives for insurers to stay in or re-enter the market. So they know, what insurers need to know mostly is what does the risk look like and can we price it? And what they worry about in the cases of these natural disaster events is the scale of the disaster might be unknown. That's why, for example, at least in the insurance market that I tend to work in, there are, like, you buy homeowners insurance, but it doesn't come with earthquake coverage and it doesn't come with flood coverage. It doesn't come with landslide coverage. If you want those things, they are available in the market, but you have to pay extra for them. Because the insurer doesn't know the scale of what that loss will look like. So they put it in a separate bucket, and then they charge a different
The
premium.
most important thing to read on your insurance policy are the exclusions at the back. That's the small print, right? And that's what's not covered. And believe me, what's there is protecting the insurance company more than it's protecting you. And so you need to know what those exclusions are and how you're going to manage if those exclusions.
Yeah, I
actually come.
completely agree, and I just want to add that, it's the wrong time to find out what your policy doesn't cover is after it's burned down, right? So it's very important to know what your policy covers and doesn't. That's why I strongly encourage you to get to know your insurance company or your insurance broker and have these conversations and not be surprised when something happens.
I think we have Jacob and then Joel.
So just a question regarding, I'm trying to wrap my head around, you're talking about scale. So for my example, my last agency, we bought commercial insurance, we had $40 an asset, I got $500 from our insurance company for COVID. It was a joke. And my question is, related specifically to earthquakes, where somebody actually opts in, is there like an industry average of like what percent is going to be covered in reality? I can do that for FEMA, and I know how much an individual is going to get statistically. I know how much the government's going to give percent of whatever based on which funding program. Is there an industry average?
So an industry average in insurance for the recoverable amount can compare to the damage claimed.
I don't know that there's an industry average because this tends to be company to company, but I can tell you that there is, every policy that I've ever seen in the earthquake space has a set limit on it, and it's not the full value or the replacement cost of it's like, it might be half or it might be a quarter, depending on the cost of the structure, but it's never 100%.
And one of the things that insurance companies do to protect themselves is they'll have a different, not premium, but a different deductible if what you're most susceptible to happens. So in Louisiana, they have a named storm deductible. That's a percentage of the overall insured value of whatever it is that you're insuring.
But
Yeah,
earthquakes is like $50.
Yeah, right, exactly. If my house would have burned down, I got to pay $500. But if a hurricane hit it, I've got to come out of my pocket with $10,000. So you want to, again, look at the exclusions, look at the small print, because that's where the insurance company is protecting themselves. To the point about some of these things like fortified roofs, Louisiana had, because of all the hurricanes that have happened there in the past 5 years, insurance companies packed their bags and ran up out of the state. And so most people in the southern part of the state actually have the state's insurance company of last resort. One of the things that the Insurance Commission is trying to do to bring people back in is supplement a mitigation program, a fortified roof program. And so those standards that were set by the agency that Ken mentioned, are now being used to set to determine how your roof should be built back. And when you have that, you can go to your insurance company. Conceivably, that's what the insurance commission is trying to work out, to say, hey, you can cut the rate because your losses are mitigated with these people who we've given $10,000 to repair their homes. And so for you all as public agencies, there is, and we're going to get into it tomorrow with the FEMA folks, the ability to get mitigation resources to do some of those things for your buildings, and to hopefully lower your insurance costs.
Joel?
To this question we're talking about unknown scale and scope, one of the things I'm planning on talking to my insurance broker about a renewal this year is parametric coverage. Can you speak to that at all, and whether you think that's something we all should be thinking about?
So
I actually don't know that much about parametric coverage, to be honest with you, and I hate to talk about things I don't know that much about, so I'm not going to venture. I know that there's a lot of discussion in the insurance industry about parametric coverage, but I don't know that much about it. So why don't we talk offline, and I'll find out more about what you want to know, and I'll get some answers for you. Happy to do that.
Any other questions any questions on Zoom?
Over here, Ed. Yeah.
Comment,
Yeah,
just quick.
Just making sure.
Okay,
Yep.
so if you ever want to learn about insurance, go through a disaster. One of the things that
Yeah.
came, and we obviously insure a lot of multifamily properties. We do it through our Joint Powers Authority, HARP. Many of you probably participate in HARP. But what we discovered with the Paradise disaster, we had a 12-unit property burned down. It was an unregulated property. It was a property the Housing Authority operated free and clear. But what I didn't know is that in the business, all of us, we probably don't insure our properties for full replacement value. We don't even come close. We basically, we're risk managers. We say, what's the odds of an event happening where in this 20-plex, one of them is going to burn down? And you kind of coverage for those kinds of things. But when you have your whole property burned down to the ground, there's a huge loss there. And there's nothing to fill that gap. Your insurance, it's very unlikely you're running property operations with full coverage on insurance replacement. It just doesn't, it's just prohibitive. So this idea of managing your risk, where do you draw the line? Where do you draw that line? How many dollars per square foot do you insure for? And then when it comes to replacement later, where's the gap? How do you fill that gap? So those are things to be reminded of. The other thing is, in the insurance business, we have the ability to insure our multifamily properties either on a pooled basis, which tends to reduce our premiums overall, or on a one-off basis. The advantage of a pooled basis, you get the cheaper premium, but if you have an event that occurs in one of the properties, it touches the entire pool. On one-off insurance is typically more expensive, but it gives you a little more room to move and adjust between properties depending on your risk profile. So,
And your deductibles tend to be higher on the pool.
correct. So deductibles you can manipulate all over the place depending on the property, the risk, to adjust your premiums.
So I did want to go back on that parametric issue because I just did a quick bit of research. And I think like the products that you're already, having to access, these are probably going to be specialty lines market products. And I want to bring this up again because the specialty lines market is different than what we call the admitted market. State Farm, Farmers, Allstate, Geico, Progressive, those are admitted carriers in Washington. They go through a rigorous process to be approved to write insurance in Washington, and then anytime they file, they want to raise rates or decrease rates, should that happen, or change something in their policy forms, that has to be submitted to, reviewed and approved by the Office of the Insurance Commissioner. So we're pretty highly regulated in that space. We have to make our case for rate increases, and the analysts at the department look it over with a fine-tooth comb. Specialty lines market, not so much. Specialty lines market has to meet a very basic set of standards to be approved to write insurance in any state, but then what they do with their rates and their policy forms is pretty much up to them. And they're given that freedom so that they can write risks that admitted carriers don't want to write, and that's the market that you're in. So what, some of these, think about a parametric product that has a set limit for, for certain risks or a group of risks under a single umbrella. Those things, are probably not going to be available in the admitted market. They're probably going to be available, if they're available, in the specialty lines market. And if there's a market for it, someone's going to write it. That's kind of how that market works, for sure.
So to piggyback on a little bit of this, so recent in-state data. So Spokane fires, I'm going to keep going back because it's kind of our most recent big event. Out of the 447 homes damaged, 362 of them destroyed. I haven't found a single person, and I actually was living out in Spokane for several months working this disaster, that was fully insured. So that's the thing about, we talk about overall, the cost to rebuild has skyrocketed over the last few years. And the people with the worst things were people who hadn't looked at their policies. Oh, I paid off my home 5 or 10 years ago. I'm just going to keep my insurance the same way, and it would stay the same. So almost everybody was underinsured. And talk about those lists of exclusions. And there were some specific ones that the FEMA programs were able to get after a little bit for people who did have insurance. But like if they're rural, and so wells, if they're more rural or they're just on the outskirts of a city, wells and well repair is not covered. Septic system repair is not covered. Access to your home, things of that aren't covered under most insurance policies. We're talking about exclusions. So those are some gaps you have to look at within any property you have. Sorry.
And so the question then becomes, should that thing get destroyed, how you're going to recover, right? That needs to go into your plan. Do you have the fiery day pot of money that sits aside for those types of events? Because those are things that are excluded from your insurance policy. As much as I've worked in this industry, I did not see until, if my house would have burned down in Louisiana, I already said it, $500, they're going to give me the full value, insured value, no problem. I didn't realize that there were tiered levels of fire protection insurance until I worked the campfire, and that most homeowners couldn't afford to have the full replacement. Like, oh, this should be easy, right? People insured, the insurance companies are going to come in, they're going to pay. And they're like, no, folks don't have enough insurance coverage to build back the homes. Well, where is it most expensive to build back a home? On the coast, right? The west in the East Coast, in the middle, not so much. So, not having a full value in a place that it is extremely expensive to build is a problem. So, thinking about how we deal with the worst case scenario, not having enough money coming from the insurance companies is an issue. HUD, I love the people on the 8th floor at HUD. They're the smartest people in the building. That's where the Office of Policy Development and Research sits. They do all these studies, and they found that the communities that recover, this has come as no surprise to anybody, right? But the communities that recover more thoroughly and most quickly are the ones that have the highest incidence of insurance. So 2 communities, same city, one, an older one where, Ed was sort of speaking to this, where the homes are mostly paid off and people haven't looked at their insurance value, how much their insurance covers up to, because one, you don't have a mortgage company hounding you about it anymore. You may not even have insurance if you're not thinking about it, if you didn't pay your annual premium, if you're paying it that way. My parents and Katrina. It may not be sufficient for whatever today's costs are, right? Dealing with that, looking at that. So this is why, in the plan, we'll suggest that you have, as a matter of course, someone whose responsibility it is to check these things and to make sure that they make sense given where you're situated now as a housing authority.
Thank you.
If I could just walk through this example of the 12 units that burned down in Paradise. It cost about $6 million to replace. We're under construction, we're rebuilding it. We had it insured, well underinsured. It was insured for about $1.2 million. We received that check from our friends at HARP. They weren't very happy. They lost the reinsurance. They will no longer insure the property. As a result, we did get our claim. We got a claim from PG&E, who burned the place down through a trust court action. But the interesting thing is we're building this property now as a matter of public policy. The entire town burns down. They're looking for leadership to rebuild the community. Who's got the horsepower? Who can do anything? Well, we have enough horsepower to come back in and symbolically rebuild a 12-unit project. But we're doing it without any idea about how we're going to insure it at the back end. We have, of course, the construction insurance. We do have the state fair plan. We anticipate going forward, like a couple of other nonprofits up in Paradise, just simply going forward. We are prepared to pay whatever it costs to buy insurance for those properties for the first 2, 3, 4 years of their operation, simply as a gesture of public faith. We are here to rebuild your community, and if we can't do it first, if we can't take a leadership position, what are we doing? So, you know, you do what you have to, you do what you can, but this is not just in a matter of insurance and underinsurance and pasting the ship back together, but it's a matter of policy. We're leaders in our community. You have to demonstrate what is coming.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm interested to hear how you piece together the reminder millions to build this property.
Okay, so it was about a $6 million property. We received $1.2 million insurance settlement. We received $2.6 million in CDBG DR, thanks to our local city, not the state. And the Housing Authority is coming out of pocket for the rest.
And so we'll get into a little bit more of that after lunch, but we are going to break. I think when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more, Kenton, about primary and secondary perils and like specific insurance. But figured to get you all out of here to beat that lunch rush or to order in.